What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, the second entry in the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy that both improves upon the original, that is to say the first entry in the Remake trilogy, but also reimagines a lot of what happened in the original game. But before we get into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below covering everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. With that in mind, it's also important I tell you here at the beginning of this that I did actually receive a review copy of this game for its PC release, which happened just recently back at the end of January, which is how I'm bringing you this review. I actually had it a few days before its official launch on PC, but it's such a big game that this took a while to get out, and so here we are. With all of that in mind, however, the 100% on Rebirth is no joke. A lot of people were telling me about this beforehand, but it is pretty all-encompassing. In fact, the achievements do cover most of it, primarily through their treasure trove achievements. Basically, there are a whole host of different minigames and other activities in this game that will reward you with certain treasures that can be added to the treasure trove, and you have to do all of those for the 100%, not to mention all of the late game typical stuff for a JRPG like combat challenges, a super boss, etc. So it's a lot in terms of that, which is why this took so long. Moving on a little bit though, this was an interesting experience for me personally because while I did play the original Final Fantasy VII, it was when I was very young. I think I was like 7. It was one of the first RPGs I ever beat by myself, in fact. But it's also been so long that while I remember a lot of the locations and names and certain events, like, how it happened or like the order of those events was very hazy to me. And so some of that was sort of reignited by simply playing through this game, like experiencing the parade in Junon. That was one of those moments where it sort of like kickstarted a bunch of really old memories for me, and I was like, oh wow, I remember doing exactly this. So it was a pretty fun experience in that regard, but also, it really does improve a lot of the original game in the trilogy. For starters, making combat a little more interesting through things like synergy, skills and abilities, a more fleshed out world, more interesting side content, even if some of it is still a little rough around the edges. And what's more, it further expounds upon the changes that were made in that first game, but also introduces a whole host of other changes to the main story as well, making it a slightly grander narrative. And we're going to get into all of that over the course of this review, but perhaps most surprisingly to me were how they changed a lot of the character intros, like for instance Cid's introduction, Yuffie's introduction, though given the first game's DLC that's probably not a huge surprise, but also just the broader goals of the main villain Sephiroth himself have been changed. And then of course, like the main thing Final Fantasy is remembered for, is roughly where this game ends, that is to say the Temple of the Ancients. And even there we see some large changes. But before we get into all that, let's first talk the technical state of the PC release. So this is one of those cases that it's a bit interesting because on one hand it ran very well for me personally, but a quick browse through Steam reviews will tell you that most people's problem with the game right now is that the PC port is having trouble running for them. Which, to be honest, I think might have to do with a lot of people's PC specs because the required specs to run this game on PC, even the minimum, are pretty high, actually. Which definitely affects things like the Steam Deck, which technically has less than the minimum required. To go along with that, things I had problems with in the first remake were fixed here. Better keybinds and overall better port, even if there are some problems for other people. Now, that's not to say everything went without a hitch for me, even if I was generally experiencing better stuff overall. Namely, I had a lot of trouble with the camera in this one. It was constantly wanting to move around, and no matter what I set the settings to, the only thing that really seemed to fix it is actually locking on to enemies, and even then, if you got next to a wall, it was hit or miss. So when it comes to how it works on PC, I would say it's definitely better than the first remake, but it's definitely not perfect either. Which brings us to the difficulty of the game. So right away we start off with easy, normal, and dynamic. Easy and normal are basically what we experienced in the prior game, normal being the sort of default playthrough, and easy simply making it easier to stagger and hurt enemies who I think have less health as well, while at the same time causing them to deal like half damage. Dynamic difficulty, on the other hand, seems to be like a level scaling feature. I don't know exactly what this affects specifically and how it actually adjusts things, but It basically caters the challenge to where you are at. But that's not all of the difficulties. After you play through the game the first time, you'll unlock hard mode as well as chapter select. So hard mode is just like the previous entry as well, in that you have to go through that chapter of the game without being able to recover your MP as easily, which means you have to be judicious about when you use certain abilities and also find ways to counteract using things like items which are no longer available to be used. Now, luckily, you can do this chapter by chapter, because also after the story is complete, you can go back and play any individual chapter of the game while choosing to either retain or reset quest progress for that chapter, and unlocking a set of extra settings in the menu as well that will let you tailor a few other features, such as deciding exactly how the game determines which character is selected for in-game events, such as during the Gold Saucer date. If you're unaware, the original game had a sort of hidden mechanic where you could go on a date with one of the characters based on how you have treated them up to that point, and that sort of makes a return here, but with chapter select, you can just choose who the game chooses for you so you can see those if you want to. And being able to jump around chapters as you see fit is going to help you, of course, clear up everything that happens after the game ends, such as those mini-games that I mentioned, but also hitting the level cap of 70 or dealing with the combat challenges, that kind of thing. From there, though, let's talk about the story setup for this one, or the continuing story, I suppose, because the original remake left the story right at the end of where you leave Midgar, where is normally where you would step out into the open world. So unsurprisingly then, Rebirth picks up right there. We find ourselves in the village of Calm just after leaving Midgar, and the story of this one is going to take us, as I mentioned, all the way up to the Temple of the Ancients portion of the original title. Now, along the way, we're going to be finding ourselves experiencing all sorts of the actual game's sort of storyline, but with a whole host of changes introduced. Now, there are some specific things I'd like to talk about, but there are also things I don't really want to get into too much for the sake of spoilers, simply because things like how the ending is handled, for example, and what happens at the Temple of the Ancients are a huge part of the original. And I think for the people who picked this up on PC recently, at least, it would be kind of rude to spoil that, so I'd like to avoid doing that as much as possible. But there are some things I want to mention. For starters, as I've already mentioned, the story was a little hazy for me. Like, I remembered the individual parts, but the exact connections were a little lost. But there was some stuff I picked up on pretty much immediately. Like, towards the beginning of the game, you have to fight a Midgardsormr, which is this giant snake in a swamp that is barring your path. In the original, while you could get into a fight with this thing, it was strongly advised that you don't, and rather just get a chocobo to run past it, whereas here that fight is inevitable, which I think they do to sort of drive home the alternative timeline thing that they set up pretty early on. Now, another thing that was changed pretty substantially are how a lot of characters get introduced. So we meet Yuffie right before Junon. We don't even go to the town where you originally met Sid, which I think was called Rocket Town. You know, here he is just an NPC you meet who's going to fly you from one area to another, before that eventually turns into a boat and you sailing the ocean portion. But then there were some things that were especially interesting to me because I had to look them up because I was like, I don't remember this at all. Such as the implementation of the Gi in Cosmo Canyon. When Red 13 returns to his hometown of Cosmo Canyon, there's a scene where he comes upon the statue of his father, and learns that his father is not in fact a coward who ran away, but rather a warrior who saved his hometown. But right after that, there's a whole sequence where we learn about the Gi and how they made something called the black materia, which serves as a huge crucial plot point in comparison to the white materia that Aerith is hanging around. And I was like, man, I don't know if I just forgot all this or what. And yeah, I had to look it up to be sure, but they did in fact add that whole sequence, as the origins of the black materia prior were much more mysterious. So it looks like they just expanded upon that plot point, and we see a lot of stuff like that throughout the game, which I thought was kind of nice, because it kind of feels like the story was aiming for essentially true to the original, but also stepping it up a notch at the same time, expanding upon certain plot points, making it a little more grandiose overall, especially when it comes to Sephiroth's own goals, which you learn at the very end of the game are a little more all-encompassing than the original titles as well. And that stuff, combined with a little bit of fan service like the beach scene, and then stuff I just remembered really fondly, like going to the Gold Saucer for the first time, were handled really impeccably well here. So broad strokes for the story. Obviously we don't see the full extent of the changes they plan on making until the third one, but it really did feel like they tried to take the original and then make it kind of its own thing at the same time. And I personally really appreciated that approach because it, allowed me to sort of be hit with nostalgia, but also still kind of wonder what was going to happen, which was a fun mix of things for me at least. Especially since they took the opportunity to, just like the first remake, double down on expanding and explaining certain characters and plot points in a much more interesting way. But that does bring us to progression this time around, which brings us to things like levels, materia, weapons, skills, and our new folios, and even our party level. So progression is pretty straightforward as it is with most JRPGs, though. For starters, we're going to be leveling up as we kill things, with level 70 being the cap. You'll probably complete the main story right around level 50 or so, and then after that happens, and you unlock hard mode and chapter select, you receive a massive bonus to XP gained, as well as AP gained to level up your materia, and at that point it's simply a matter of going into hard mode and clearing a few battles, and you'll be leveling up super fast to level 70 to knock out the rest of everything else. One of the bigger progression systems, though, is materia. Now, you're going to receive a fair bit of this right at the start, such as certain summons you'll have obtained in the first portion of the game, but you'll still probably be a little worse off than you left the original if you're starting here immediately afterwards. But that wasn't a huge surprise, at least to me, so it could have been worse. Now, they did add a few new materia, specifically materia that allows your companions to do things with their weapons on their own, such as activating their weapon skills or their unique abilities. That's important because in the previous version, you actually had to manually swap to that character in order to activate those specifically, because you could use autocast on other types of magic to get them to do it by themselves otherwise, and you can even sort of pause combat and switch over to give them instructions when their ATB gauge is full normally, but you can't do that for the weapons and special attacks, which these two materia allow you to do. Otherwise, materia works the same way. As you gear up, you'll have more materia slots for your characters, you'll be able to slot all sorts of magic and general boosts to your character, and with connected slots you can even cause them to do things together, like for instance auto cast healing spells or those abilities like I mentioned, and then you can even synergize stuff later. It's an overall really cool system that I've always enjoyed, and it was nice to see it in play here still. Following on from that, we then have our weapons and skills. So gear wise, we basically have weapon, armor slot, which is basically like a small armor bangle type thing, and then an accessory. Your weapon and armor are where your materia slots come from, but each weapon that you equip for each character has a skill that they can master. Once they use that skill and then master it, they can then use that weapon skill with any weapon equipped, so it's something you want to do with everyone regardless of whatever weapon they land on. But here's where it gets a little bit different from the first remake, because in that one they had you doing weapon upgrades, where you would sort of go into an individual weapon and then purchase a bunch of upgrades with skill points. Well, that has been mostly off-put into the new folio system, whereas weapons do have an upgrade system. Basically, the more you play a character and level them up, their weapon level will go up as well, and that will give them access to little boosts that they can slot in a similar way to materia on that same page. But the otherwise weapon upgrade system has actually been applied to the new folios. Basically, every character has a big skill tree that they can spend the skill points they get upon leveling up and from earning manuscripts throughout the game and extra content on learning these individual abilities. These abilities, which require your party level to be at a certain minimum, which is basically just experience you get for running through the game. But as you unlock these skills, you can unlock passives for your character generally, but also synergy skills and abilities to use in combat, which see each individual character utilizing teamwork to deal more and more damage, and status effects and other positive things to your side of the combat system. So I thought that was a neat little change, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But basically, progression comes down to leveling up, getting better gear, upgrading your materia, which has its own separate experience known as AP that you also get from combat, and then of course utilizing that in the most effective way possible. Which brings us to the gameplay and world section, by far the biggest area of this game, because as we step out into the open world of Final Fantasy VII, this game itself is thus open world, as opposed to the much more linear experience of Remake Intergrade. That means that this open world is full of things to do, namely those minigames I mentioned, but also a host of other activities, the main story obviously, but also other objectives like tracking down the chocobo for each area, special challenge fights, tracking down the proto-relic, side quests of course, various methods of fast travel, and the like. Now, I will say it is a little checklisty for sure. I think it still manages to be fun, but outside of the various means of traversal, such as via the chocobos, I really didn't see anything that was super unique. It was just a lot of fun to play through. But let's talk a little bit about that, starting with the chocobos. So, you would get a chocobo in the original to run around the world map in, but you could also later on in the game breed different kinds which had different effects. Well, here here we have to catch a chocobo for each individual area, which involves solving a little puzzle to catch it. But then once you've caught it, it will be one of a few different kinds of colors, which will have different effects, such as the gray ones being able to walk up cliff faces. Later on, you can fly or glide through Cosmo Canyon. And then in Nibble, you can even get a sea chocobo, which will float over the water, more or less. Now that's going to make traversal much easier, but it's not your only option. You do actually get a buggy later on. At one point, Sid is available to fly you to different regions, and then later on in the story still, you can actually sail to different regions or just straight up fast travel between them once you get to that point, which it restricts you a little bit on in the early chapters. There also are special fights. There are a host of unique monsters roaming the land that you can get into battle with, and they'll have like little sub-objectives where you can try to deal with that combat encounter while maintaining certain criteria like staggering enemies or something. But each individual area also has a sort of secret boss encounter of sorts that you could call it. Basically, once you sort of clear some of the other objectives, you can track down a much stronger enemy that then gets reused a lot later in the Colosseum, by the way, and have a more interesting fight against that, such as the Mind Flayer, the Jabberwocky, or something of that nature. Then there are the proto-relics, perhaps one of the more interesting things to do around the open world. Each individual little area has a sort of little story involving a proto-relic, which happens to be a bit of Genji from Gilgamesh. Basically, if you complete any of the proto-relics, you'll start getting visions of Gilgamesh, and then upon collecting all of these leads to the ultimate showdown with Gilgamesh, who sort of acts as this game's super boss. Upon beating Gilgamesh in combat, you'll actually get the option to take on additional combat encounters via Chadley. Chadley here puts you onto the world intel, which is basically checking off all of the objectives you can do out in the open world, such as hitting up the Rimna-Wave towers to reveal other objectives before going and doing those, such as interacting with the Moogle house. All of that, though, gives you world intel points, and you can spend those at Chadley to have him develop more materia for you, or to even potentially take on battles with summons to acquire new ones like Odin, Bahamut, Arisen, Phoenix, etc. So there's a lot to do, and that's before you even get to the side quests. So the side quests are generally better than they were in the first remake, but I wouldn't say they're perfect either. So in the first part, they basically just felt like filler, and there are certainly some quests like that here, but they are generally a bit more interesting because they involve bringing back older characters and expanding upon their little mini-stories, or giving you access to more things to do, like various mini-games or versions of those mini-games, so they can be a pretty good time. However, they're not immune to that criticism either, because some of them are definitely bloat. There's one where you have to slowly escort chickens back to a woman in a village, only for her to end up cooking them and feeding them to Red 13, which admittedly was funny, but it was a very boring quest. Luckily, stuff like that was relatively minimal, but it was in there. But then there's the mini-games and the treasure trove. So this game has mini-games for days. Genuinely, probably a couple dozen. They range from really fun to honestly kind of superfluous, and it's a bit of a mixed bag if you actually go through and try to collect all of them in order to collect the trophies for the treasure trove. Once you get to the beach scene, you'll unlock the treasure trove via Johnny, a character from the first part as well, who sets up a hotel there. By completing all these activities, you can get people to go to his hotel and, look at all of it. And this basically touches every aspect of the game. It's honestly probably the biggest mark of 100%. And unfortunately, your reward for having done that is just a bit of sheet music, which is disappointing, frankly. But the sheet music does actually bring me to the mini game that I had the most trouble with, which was the piano mini game. You can find sheet music and pianos throughout the game, and then of course play that sheet music on those pianos, and the keyboard setup for this is nightmarish. It took a lot of practice to get good at this, and I mostly had to do it by slightly turning my keyboard a little, so the keys lined up with my fingers in a way that was a little more natural specifically for this minigame, but I really struggled with this one. That said, there are a whole host of others that I thought were really cool. For starters, Queen's Blood, the card game that was added to this one, and I really enjoyed this. I'm not going to bother explaining all the rules, but basically you have a bunch of different cards with different effects that allow you to control different lanes on a card table. And while the card game itself is fun enough, I actually wound up with like the full 6 decks and I was customizing them to beat different opponents and stuff. I got really into it. There's also a whole like little quest line associated with this that I thought was really neat. It's pretty well done. My favorite of the mini games by far. I would genuinely probably play that as a standalone thing. But then there were also the Chocobo races. I really enjoyed those. Remembered playing through them as a kid as well. None of them were particularly hard, but I had a lot of fun doing them. And the Chocobo races are at the Golden Saucer. The Golden Saucer itself has tons of minigames, many of them returning from the first part as well, such as the motorcycle section or arena challenges, etc., though these were all in the original as well, besides Queen's Blood. So between all of the side quests, all of the minigames, all of the world intel, there is a nonsense amount of stuff to do in this game, and seeing it all is a time-consuming endeavor, which is almost certainly why people warned me against the 100% on this one, because it is no joke. And the interesting thing, at least in comparison to other games that I've played, isn't so much that it's like an outrageous amount of stuff, like I've definitely 100% games that took 5 times as long as this. The thing is, it's just that with all of these different minigames, there's so many things you have to master to get the 100%, it feels kind of outrageous. So it's not just like, master this combat and you can finish everything in this game. It's like master this minigame, master this minigame, master this minigame, master the combat as well. So it's not only just a big amount of content, but it also asks you to master a lot of different stuff in order to knock it out. But then, of course, we can hardly leave out the arguably biggest part of the game, really, and that is combat. So combat is simultaneously mostly the same as the first part, but also add a lot of new additions. Now, personally, again, I think this game's combat comes together the most in hard mode. That's where everything it's trying to do kind of comes together and forces you to think a little more about what you're doing, while at the same time having the resources to actually do that. So most of what I want to focus here on is the new stuff, but realistically, there's a chance this might be the only part of the remake trilogy that you have played, since the third one isn't out yet, and maybe you skipped past the first one, even if it is ill-advised. And to that end, combat is action-based for the most part. You'll perform basic and heavy attacks more or less. With your main character, you can switch between anybody in your party, including your companions, which we'll touch on in a moment, and they each have their own unique play style with unique abilities such as Barrett's Overcharge, his natural ranged attack, Aerith's magic and teleport, Tifa's ability to build up chi, Kate Sith's Moogle that he can ride on because he is in fact a sort of manufactured toy, or Yuffie's ninjutsu. Slowly over time, or more quickly as you attack with any of these characters, they build up their ATB gauge. You have 2 slots of this by default and can spend that ATB on actually taking action, such as using items if you're not on hard mode, or casting spells or abilities. Enemies are generally weak to various elements or types of attacks, or even have certain mechanics that can lead to them being pressured. Pressured sees a rapid increase of their stagger bar. Using certain abilities to do that even faster, we can stagger enemies who then are basically stunned and take increased damage for a set amount of time. That's like the core of the combat system. But there's also a handful of new things I want to mention, namely the synergy skills and abilities, which are surprisingly different things. So basically, as your characters take actions with their ATB gauges, they start earning up to 5 little synergy ticks. Once you've accumulated so many of those, you can activate a synergy ability provided you've learned it via the character's folios. This allows 2 characters in your party to work together to perform an attack of some sort or some other general benefit. These synergy abilities don't cost you any MP or anything, just the synergy resource. Now, these are useful beyond just this though, because each of these synergies will generally do one of a few different things. They can increase your limit level for that combat. Basically, every one of our characters has a whole host of different limit breaks. Limit breaks charge up as you get hit, at least primarily anyway, and normally you can only use the level 1. However, using synergy abilities, you can increase the limit level, allowing you to cast your level 2 and 3 abilities potentially. You can also use synergy abilities to increase the time a character is staggered. That is to say, an enemy that you've staggered, you can use a synergy ability to increase that timer. However, I found that ironically, most of these synergy abilities take so long to actually play out animation wise that the time you add to their stagger bar is basically almost immediately spent anyway. And then still others will actually give you access to unlimited MP for a short time, basically making your spells and abilities free to cast outside of the ATB gauge cost. So that was a pretty cool system, but then we have the synergy skills. Basically, while you're guarding or pressing the block button, you can also activate a few other different abilities with other characters as well, which can let you do things like perform a special move out of a block or anything. They're less substantial than the synergy abilities, and they take a little more to master. I never really got the hang of them myself, to be honest, but they are there. Some other new things, though, are the perfect block and dodge system. I believe these were technically in the DLC for the first part, but are more prominent here. Basically, if you can time your guard perfectly against certain enemy attacks, you'll just avoid the damage entirely, and potentially even pressure certain enemies, giving you naturally then a big boost in combat. Now, a few general complaints about this system, though. For starters, while we did get materia that allows us to use our companion's abilities and unique abilities via our weapons and stuff on their own, it still doesn't work super well. You often have to switch to these characters and manually do everything for them, because a lot of times they'll barely even basic attack enemies for you. And while thanks to this new materia, they're not completely useless, mind you, it really just does feel like you have to micromanage each and every single one of them in order to get the most out of them, because like way too often I find them literally just standing still looking at enemies instead of doing anything. And that is very frustrating, especially when I've already seen PC mods for this that dramatically increase their aggressiveness and allow them to more actively attack enemies, that is to say, just basic attack them, which would be a very welcome change, because basic attacks would actually fill up their ATB gauge and I could get to use them more often. So I'd really just wish they would increase how often they would do just the bare bones basics. And it's probably the thing I dislike about this system the most. Now, introduced in this game, a problem that I didn't really have in the first part was the camera issues. So for whatever reason, the camera is just way worse in this one. I had a hard time getting it to stop like dramatically moving around unless I was just actively locked onto something, but even then, certain battle arenas make that even potentially a problem, such as the camera getting stuck on things like walls and whatnot, and especially in the Colosseum with things like larger enemies, it can really feel like you're fighting the camera more than the boss sometimes, and that's never a great feeling, especially when you're at the end game trying to wrap up the super hard, challenging combat encounters from Chadley that unlock after you defeat Gilgamesh, or even simply on hard mode without items, which is a shame because while the combat system might seem simple enough on the face of things, when you combine everything I just said basically with the different tactics and abilities that monsters can have and the different ways you need to pressure them and, trying to remember all that, there is actually a decently deep and engaging system here that I wish was just a little more user-friendly, I guess, at times. But nonetheless, we have a whole host of different characters to engage in combat with. Cloud, of course, Tifa, Barret, and Aerith from the first game as well. Red 13 is a full-fledged companion in this one rather than joining you at the very end, though Vincent Valentine does a very similar thing in this one where he joins you towards the end, but you don't really get to have him as a proper party member. We also get Kate Sith, which, just like Yuffie before in the first part, I was happy to hear I've actually been pronouncing correctly this whole time, which is usually not something I managed to pull off. And each of them plays a little differently, and having all that variety in your party, especially parts where you can switch between all these different characters and get to use them to their fullest, like the last boss fight, or, slew of last boss fights, I should say, was a pretty good time. And what's more, all of them get a really solid narrative arc. One nice thing about this way bulked up version of the original, where, what might have been a much shorter experience previously is now this massive open world RPG unto itself. All of these characters get a really satisfying narrative experience that is going to flesh out their characters in ways that someone like myself who played it a long time ago can appreciate, but is also just better generally for the people experiencing it for the first time. But that does finally bring us to the Steam Deck performance for this one. So, officially speaking, this game has a rating of verified on the Steam Deck, though truth be told, I feel like it deserves more of a rating of playable, though in fairness, I'm surprised this game runs at all on the Steam Deck, given what its minimum specs look like. So you can play this on the Steam Deck, it's fine. It's just that you're likely going to get like 25 to 30 FPS, and it's not going to look particularly good. They did put a lot of work into making sure you can play this, because the minimum specs required are above what the Steam Deck has. So I fully admit it's probably more playable than you would expect it to be, but I'd also venture a guess it's probably like the worst way to experience this game, and you can definitely feel them fighting the hardware on that one. Though that does bring us to the positives, negatives, and then we'll wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things, Obviously, just all the improvements, the expansions on various lore topics, I really enjoyed that. Improvements mostly from the first part, fixing up just little things from that first remake, like, being able to rebind all of the keys as an example, or letting you mess around with different types of materia to make up for some of the shortcomings in your party. And while that's not perfect, it's definitely a step in the right direction. There's also just the story and characters at large, which is something that I fondly remember, and getting to re-experience that both in a way that is nostalgic while at the same time, like what's going to happen next, was a lot of fun for me. And then there's even those side activities that I thought were really well done. Queen's Blood is a fantastic minigame. There's a lot of other really fun minigames. And when you put all that together, you can tell that a lot of love for the original title was put into this. But nonetheless, it does have some negatives. So I didn't get into this a whole host, mostly because I wanted to avoid spoilers and how it addresses certain characters. But what I will say on that front is that there is a whole lot of like timelines and stuff that sort of converge and are happening throughout the game that you'll get little cutscenes for. And it's not exactly told in the most clear of ways. I think it kind of comes together at the end there, but for much of the game, I was like, I don't understand what's happening with this. And it mostly just felt kind of confusing until you finally start to piece it together. And while I generally enjoyed the story and everything, that part specifically was a little hard to follow, frankly. Beyond that complaint, though, basically everything else I've got is tiny nitpick stuff, admittedly. Not being able to have party members do things on their own, seeing them just stand around and do nothing when they could at the very least be doing basic attacks to fill up their ATB gauge would be super helpful. The camera is really annoying in this PC port. A handful of the quests are not fun, such as that chicken one that I outlined as an example. A lot of the mini-games are going to be hit or miss for individual people, so there's a handful of things there that kind of hurt the experience a little bit, and then of course with this being a PC, I think the performance clearly could have stood to be improved for a lot of people, even if it was mostly fine for me. And all of that brings me to my conclusion. By and large, I would say Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is a very large, fun reimagining of a timeless classic. And while change in any form will never be universally praised, I think this game was great. A lot of the reasons I've been enjoying this series, the first part and this one, are specifically because of the changes that they brought to the table with these. I think if they were just a one-for-one, I probably wouldn't have enjoyed it as much because, as I mentioned in that first video, I have the original Final Fantasy VII on my PC. If I wanted to, I could just play that. So seeing what they did with the story and how they reimagined all of it has been a lot of fun for me. Like I mentioned, it's like nostalgia, but also I don't know what's going to happen, and it's a very strange feeling. I really enjoy the overall concept of the combat system, even if I still think it needs some refining here and there. And all of that combined has me very curious how they'll wind up wrapping up the series as a whole. As I mentioned, there's some weird timeline stuff there. The exact goals that Sephiroth has have been altered slightly, and I'm very curious to see where they're going to take that, or if it really is just a slightly grander version of the original, perhaps. But either way, I mostly had a lot of fun with it. I probably wouldn't recommend anybody 100% this one, genuinely, but the core experience is very good. And if you're on PC, I would definitely do some research, of course, to see whether or not this is going to run for you. But barring that, I think it's well worth your money, especially since, even since its launch on Steam, it's already been on sale a couple of times. Chances are you'll probably be able to get this for a reduced price even. So all of that in consideration, definitely gets a buy out of me. Hope you enjoyed the review. If you did, by all means, let me know about it down in the comment section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.